If we build climate funds that have worse returns than other funds, LPs aren't going to put more money into climate. I don't want them to just say, let's put 5 or 10% of our money into climate because we want to do the good thing. This is not philanthropy. I want them to say, oh, we're putting money into climate because this is where we're going to have the highest returns.
That's Heidi Lindvall, a general partner at Pale Blue Dart, a pre-seed and seed-stage climate tech VC created by 3 former entrepreneurs. In today's episode, we'll talk about impact reporting and how it affects venture capital.
What we tend to do is write this pretty short climate thesis where we first of all say, is impact linked to the business model? If they make more money, will it have exponentially more impact?
But also about how to help climate tech funders
learn how to build startups in general. I think climate tech is no different.
And how investing in impact affects fundraising.
And I remember some LPs turned us down because we didn't have enough climate experts on board, and they felt like you can't build a climate VC without being a climate experts.
And some hot takes.
We're going to show people that you can put money into climate and make money. And then some people might say, oh, but is this climate enough? When they look at our portfolio, and I'm okay with that.
Thank you to everyone listening to this episode. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, don't forget to follow and give us a 5-star review. Enjoy this episode. So let's dive in. Thank you so much, Heidi, for coming on the show. Do you mind to quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, well, thank you, first of all, for having me. Really excited to talk about this with you today. My name is Heidi Lindvall. As mentioned, I'm one of the general partners at Pale Blue Dot. We started this fund in 2020 and are now in our second fund. So we've done just over 40 investments in pre-seed and seed stage companies in Europe and US, all broadly within climate, but climate being a very wide definition for us. My background before that was originally human rights. I used to run a documentary filmmaking company, making documentaries on social and global issues around the world. And then I went into tech about 15 years ago now, really just trying to be part of the building side and trying to figure out how we could solve a lot of the problems we're having and trying to figure out what part tech could play in solving a lot of problems we have. So from there on, I started a few tech companies, more SaaS marketplaces. Neither was very successful, but learned a lot on the journeys. Spent most of my career in London and sometime in Silicon Valley and Berlin as well. And then after that, I first started an accelerator. I was built an accelerator program in London, part of Open Data Institute, after which I moved to Sweden to set up a accelerator program here together with who's now my partner, Phil Dot as well, with Joel. And so I started founder, I've been an kind of enabler on the accelerator side, and then I've been an investor for the past 5-ish years now.
Yeah, that's cool. It's quite a journey to venture capital. But I'm curious, Heidi, before we start, I think it's important for me to understand, why did you want to invest in climate tech companies in the first place? Why is this choice specifically?
Sure. So this actually was a bit of a journey. A lot of people thought that was the obvious thing that we came together and saying we're going to do climate, but actually it wasn't. I knew when I decided that I wanted to go to investment side, I knew it was going to be positive impact broadly. And obviously having the human rights background, that's always been my trajectory to try to figure out how we can back really amazing founders who are changing the world for the better. But climate was something that my partner Hampus was spending a lot of time on at the time. And, at one point, but it wasn't an obvious, we talked a lot about a lot of different type of funds. We were more set on the three of us. We're going to build a better VC fund than VC funds that existed nowadays. And then Hampus spent some time in climate. And then he kind of said, hey, I think this climate thing might be it. And at the time, I remember feeling like I felt so removed from climate. It was so scientific. It was all about, these X targets and this many carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. And I felt like it was so hard to relate to it. While having been in human rights, I felt like, a lot of things that felt a lot more human and you had a human connection with. But then I also realized that that's probably the biggest opportunity there is, because this is our biggest humanitarian crisis. And we all need to be involved in it, and we need more people who maybe aren't feeling connected to the matter, to be more connected to it, which I felt like was an opportunity to work on storytelling, and it's an opportunity to just try to figure out how to engage more people. So yeah, essentially that was my own personal journey. And then Joel, our third partner, he hadn't been flying for like 6 years at the time. He'd already kind of decided that his life was going to be in climate, and for him it was a pretty obvious choice as well that this is something that we should be doing. But we also very much believe that climate was going to be, and we still do, that climate was going to be the one time that we're going to see the highest return in impact from the same companies, that we're actually going to see a sector take over and become so big that we can actually convince LPs that this is actually a great place to make money, and not go through the same road that we did with the clean tech bubble previously. So this was also, opportunistic in that side of a sense, that we felt like if we did broader impact, we don't know if it's possible, but in climate we thought it is.
Yeah, and there's a lot to your answer there, I think, that I want to dive into. Because the first thing you said is that climate investing, I think people don't realize, but it's really about investing in people and in humanity, because the planet's going
Yeah.
to live long after we die. That's not a
Yeah.
problem. Like if it's +5 degrees, the planet's going to be okay, but we'll all die. So I think that's one thing that people don't realize always. Like climate investing is really about solving for the biggest problem humanity is facing. The second thing I want to get back to is you said something about the scientific aspect of climate investing. And that's a question I always like to ask impact VCs, because it's such a complex space where, like, if you don't have a scientific degree, it's always so hard to, understand what a company is about. I'm curious if you can just briefly explain, how do you make a conviction for yourself when you look at a company that sometimes you have a hard time to really understand how it works, right, within the product?
So I think this is a big difference with maybe Pale Blue Dot and some other climate VCs as well. And maybe we'll get into that topic of why that specifically is later. But we are all people who've been on the startup side. Like we've been in the startup bubble. We've all built our own software businesses. We all raised money and been on the kind of the other side of the table. So we're more kind of startup people, startup founders who have now gone into VC than any of us are climate experts. Like all of our careers had been in tech or human rights or media or something else, but not in climate. So of course we've now educated ourselves on the topic, and of course we're always reading about climate, trying to understand it. But I would say that climate, as well as any other investment sector within VC, is similar to the extent that you really need to understand the business model. Of course, you need to understand the opportunity and the problem high level, but at the same time, you really need to understand that, is there a business model that's scalable here, and are these the founders that are going to take us there? So actually, it's less about the climate knowledge, and it's actually something we thought a lot about when we started the fund. And I remember some LPs turned us down because we didn't have enough climate experts on board, and they felt like you can't build a climate VC without being climate experts. But the job we do is talk to startups trying to figure out if they can build a unicorn business, if they can scale this business. The stuff they need help with is going to be sales, marketing, recruitment, all of the same things that any other company is going to need help with. They don't need help with the climate side. They know that side. That's like the one thing they do. Like that's their domain expertise. That's their passion. So we actually understood that we, of course, need to find enough knowledge to be able to do the due diligence if it's very technical. And then you'll just have to find the professors or whoever are the experts to do that. But actually, most of the time, if you know that, okay, well, this is a more efficient way of, charging your EV, then we know it's going to be needed. We don't have to go into detail. We don't have to measure exactly what. We can figure out, is this the product we think is going to win? Do we think this is, do we know this is a problem big enough? We might not need so many experts, but then it's all about, is this a viable business model? How fast is this sector going to grow? How much money can you charge? All of the same things. So actually, to go back to answer your question, I actually think that the climate expertise is the one thing that I felt very concerned about to start with, and I felt like an imposter, and I realized that I just don't need almost whatsoever in my job, apart from the initial understanding that it is a problem. But again, that I can like ask ChatGPT. It's not so complex. But the really doing the valuation and saying, do you think this is going to be the best fund returner? That's the really hard job with being a VC, whatever sector you do it in.
And I think to wrap it up on that point, because I think I need to get us back on track to the topic of the day. But what you said there is like basically climate investing is not that different from standard investing in software investing, for example. And also, I just wanted to touch on the point you said earlier about you really believe that it's the biggest opportunity of the decade in terms of like economical opportunity. And I love that point because I think climate is not a market, it's not a vertical, it's more like horizontal, but it's really everywhere. It's in everything we do. So I agree with you that I think the opportunity is massive. And I love for people to understand that, climate tech are great businesses. They are not philanthropy or whatsoever. They are really businesses that makes money, and we'll see more and more unicorn in that space, hopefully. And hopefully within your portfolio as well. But to get back
Definitely.
on the topic of the day, so today we want to talk about impact measurements and why it matters for VC. And I think before even getting started on your thoughts about impact measurement, can you define it for me? What does it mean for you?
So I think there's a lot of different definitions on what impact measurement actually is. But I feel like the simplest way that I think of it is that everything that you do essentially has an impact. Like all of the companies you invest in will have an impact, but a positive or a negative. And like for me, impact measurement doesn't have to be as complex as, oh, you have to set up these really crazy, difficult frameworks to try to figure out what is good, what is the best that they could possibly be. But it really can be a rather simple way of having thoughtful conversations or being thoughtful about whether this is actually good for anyone. Is this good for society? Is this good for the world? And that is essentially high level what impact measurement is. And I want to add here that I don't believe impact measurement is something that only impact VCs should do. I think impact measurement is something that every single VC should be doing before they make any type of investment, because again, everything will have an impact, and we shouldn't just recognize what has the most positive impact, but we should also recognize like what actually has a negative impact.
Do you think that everybody cares about the impact that a company has? Like, don't you think some people are just greedy and they just want to make money through venture capital?
100%. And I think we should be calling it out. And I think we should be talking about that more. I think VC has a pretty bad reputation for a very good reason. And because a lot of people are just greedy for power and money. And I think we should be having those conversations. We should be saying, okay, this fund are making these type of bets. They're all negative impact bets. They are doing bad things for society. Like, call it success if you want, if you look at the return of investments. But if you look at the amount of kids that are affected by this and how, then we should be talking about it. We shouldn't just let that slide.
For sure. And I find interesting that, for example, within the banking ecosystem, we're more and more calling out banks that are financing, fuel projects or whatever, but not so much within the VC ecosystem.
No.
I wonder if that's ever going to come. But you mentioned something. So you said impact is about a company that has broader impact than just revenue on its ecosystem. Let's frame it like that. What does that mean? Because, for example, let's take an example of like a carbon removal company. Okay, they will remove carbon from the atmosphere, but is that the only thing that you should look out for? Because maybe they will also use energy for that, and within the energy there might be some, petrol fuel energy or whatever that is that also, creates CO2 emission. Like, where is the scope of impact? Like, what is the extended scope of impact measurement for a company?
Well, this is the thing. This is where I am not such a big fan of going down the rabbit hole of making the best impact measurement, because I do believe that the most important thing would be for all of us to do some kind of high level measurement of, is this negative, is this neutral, or is this good, right? And then, like I said, you could definitely go that to that extent and say, okay, how much carbon emissions will this reduce, and how much energy will it take in order to do so, and where, and to what scale do you need to get for this to actually become positive? Like, you can go really deep on that side if you want to, but at the same time, we invest in early stage companies at pre-seed and seed. At this time, it's like 2 to 5 people when we invest. Are we going to ask them to spend a lot of time on trying to make these calculations that are made up from thin air because they have no idea what pricing they're going to have, what their machinery is going to cost? Like, they have no idea. They're just going to make up some calculations to satisfy us and say, oh, it fits in with our framework. So I actually don't think these frameworks are helpful to this extent. What we tend to do is write this pretty short climate thesis where we first of all say, is impact linked to the business model? If they make more money, will it have exponentially more impacts? Like, will it be like a shadow where this grows and the impacts will grow in parallel to that? And if that's true, and then of course we look at, is this an actual problem? Should this be solved? Will it be positive for the world? Will it, should this exist? But we don't put a cap on saying, oh, only if it's this length or only if it's this much. We don't have any specific CO2 reduction targets or anything like that. And we don't ask them for LCAs or theory change or anything like that. What we say is, we do our own climate thesis where we say, okay, we know this is a big area. We do our own research to make sure that we think this is worth solving. And then we just high level think about, like, how big could this actually get and how important this is. And then we asked them to take a climate pledge, which is essentially saying that it's more about value alignment. It's really saying that this is, we're actually doing for climate impact. We will be measuring what we do. We will be looking at reducing our emissions and how we do stuff. And we're going to go on this journey essentially. But it doesn't promise anything specific, and there are no specific targets. So, for a climate VC, I think we're very low on impact measurement.
And to that extent, so am I understanding correctly that the way you look at things is more from a qualitative perspective? So you actually write text as opposed to build business plan on Excel. Like, simply put, that's what you're doing. You believe more in the power of words and just saying, okay, that's where we believe they're going to have an impact, as opposed to like actually measuring the amount or the quantity of the impact. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think climate is a value alignment. Climate is the why of why a lot of our founders are doing what they do. We're not looking at quantifying how big that impact is, but we're trying to figure out if that founder is doing this for reasons that we agree with. And if so, they're going to figure out how they can have a high impact in everything they do, both in terms of how they build their company and, reduce emissions internally and all of those things, but also just in terms of the kind of culture they're setting, whether they're encouraging their staff to eat vegetarian food and bike to work, and whatever it is, it's a value alignment. So I think for us to take any company and say, oh, this is exactly what we want you to do in the exact targets, it's just so hard to enforce, and it's not really how it works. It's more about picking the leaders that are already aligned with wanting to create that world, and then you back them. So I don't believe that we will achieve enough behavior change. And then for us to have everything written in contracts and try to enforce them, it's going to be really hard. So I believe in picking the people who are already on that journey with us, and then backing them on that journey. So definitely much more qualitative than it is quantitative for us.
Yeah, and I mean, you might not need to enforce anything as long as you're aligned on what it means to have an impact and a positive impact on the world. I think that's the primary thing. And then it's just like a people conversation, like one person agreeing to another person on what to do in the future. You mentioned a couple of things already, and I want to get into your investment process because there are quite a few things that you mentioned that are very interesting. The first thing you said is the impact revenue link. I'd be curious if you can dive a little bit more on what it means, and also how much it is important for you within your investment process that there is, let's say, one-to-one correlation between the dollar of revenue and one, whatever that is, metric of impact.
Yeah. So again, there's no good measurement. There's no specific way we do it. We essentially have this ESG we have both an ESG self-assessment, and then we have an internal ESG assessment that we do with the companies. And essentially, we ask questions such as, is impact directly linked to the business model? And if so, how? And then, how do you think about the environmental impact of the company and social impact, et cetera? And we ask a lot of those questions. And then we go into our own assessment. We also kind of define that we believe that this is the case. And what I mean by that is that we wouldn't back a company that says, you buy this pair of shoes and then we donate a second pair or anything like this. It really has to be linked to these shoes in this, and this is maybe not a great example, but would actually make the world better if you would all be wearing these shoes. So it has to be linked with what you're directly producing. But it is very vague, and it is a conversation every time. So we then tend to internally have conversations such as, if you have a better way of making candy that's reduces emissions, is that actually better for the world? Okay, there's emission reductions and people eat a lot of candy, but then we're like, is that actually good for the world? Do we think that we need more candy? Do we need better, cheaper candy? So these are always these big conversations. It's not as easy as to saying, oh, but it reduces, the more candy people eat, the more reduction there will be. So it's always a discussion internally, and we have really difficult conversations sometimes. And there have been a lot of companies that have been funded that we decided that we didn't think this was good for the world. And they've still been funded and, had a lot of success. And sometimes we think, is it right? But at the same time, we're investing in the future that we want to see. We're not just purely saying we're going to give money to the ones in climate that have the best returns if we don't think it's aligned with what, again, the future we want to see looks like.
Yeah. So what you're saying there is that the impact revenue link is just like, it's almost like a yes or no conversation. If your revenue is not linked to your impact, then it's definitely a no, because like you're not going to invest. But it's not because that it is linked to your revenue is linked to the impact that you will have, that you would invest, because there's much more to it than that. I mean, the example with the candy was perfect. I think it's a great example to illustrate that point. Something else you said about funders, and I think they call it intentionality, how much they really want their company to have an impact. I think that's a topic that a lot of VCs have mentioned already as part of their investment process. I'm curious, we were talking about measurement, and I think that's maybe a bit of a sideway there, but like, how do you measure intentionality? Like, how do you make sure that people are really aligned, and that, this is no, let's call it BS. I don't want to say the word, but it's no BS what they're telling you, right?
I think that's really, really hard. And the hardest thing is that when you don't meet founders in person to really try to get to know them and try to, know where their hearts are and what drives them. And we just have multiple conversations. First of all, we don't have any hierarchy in our investment team. So it's just the three of us partners who have the meetings directly, because it's really about us getting to know them rather than just gathering information from them. And how we get that information is really important. And all the nuances in, how someone tells you something and the text you get, et cetera, are also really important to really try to create that picture of who this person is. And then all three of us partners are involved in the sense that, we all different people, we all see different things, and we all also understand things differently. But saying that, we don't meet all of our companies in person before we invest. So it's just a lot of conversations, about what drives them and, where they come from, and understanding of how entrepreneurial they are, and really trying to understand their ambition and why they do certain things a certain way. But it's really hard to get that. But I think mainly I would say that, since I think founders do know, and all the ones who come to us generally have done enough research to know that we invest only in things that are, doing something within climate. You tend to get people who are doing it for those reasons. Otherwise, they generally wouldn't want a climate focused VC. So, but I think it's always trying to figure out that just because you care about climate doesn't make you a good person. It doesn't make you a good founder. It doesn't mean that you're gonna lead a team in a great way, it doesn't mean that you're super ambitious. Like there's a lot of these things that we still don't know. So yeah, there's no good answer to that. I think it's a lot of conversations. I know some VCs do tests and stuff, but I don't know. I just believe in conversations and trying to get to know a person and really trying to form that relationship, because also that relationship is so important for them reaching out to us when they need help at a later time as well. So it's not just for making the assessment. It's really about relationship building all the way.
No, for sure. And I was reading an article the other day that was saying that basically the average VC founder relationship is longer than the average marriage, I think, which is funny to say, but it's actually like it's a long relationship. Your investors on your cap table, they're going to stay until either you very much succeed or either your company dies, but they will be there throughout the entire journey. So I think the relationship aspect is very important. And to your point about people and building relationship, there was an article about Jessica Livingston, which is the one of the founder of YC. She's a little less famous, but she was described as a people person, like the one identifying great funders. I'm curious, you're an early stage fund, you invest in impact company. How much weight would you put against funders within your investment decision? Like, how important is it that they have a good business model versus like a great funding team?
The great founding team is everything. I think a lot of the other things change, like the business model changes, the product changes, like you will pivot a lot of times. But there being a strong founding team that is ambitious and has a good vision for the company and kind of knows what great looks like is really, really important. And I think that is worth taking a bet on. We do sometimes invest that early where there is nothing else than a founding team in place, and the material they give us is them writing a pitch deck in like 10 minutes, and we'll be like, okay, I guess this is it. But at the same time, we're thinking, is there something in this space that we believe that these founders can specifically solve, and are they the best founders to solve this? And do they have the capabilities of raising or building that billion-dollar company? So it's all about the founders. And I think, yeah, it's hard to put a lot of weight on other things when it's this early.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. I think because there is nothing else anyway to analyze. I mean, like people saying VC is a finance business, but it's definitely like at least early stage is a very much people focused business, because like, yeah, you look at the financials that has maybe 6 months of history with like projection for 10 years. Like, I think it's very hard to really identify what's happening there and what's truth.
For sure. To add on that, though, that, just so people don't misunderstand it, that as in we will only talk to founders and judge the founders based on their abilities to do something. I mean, the ability to execute is obviously very, very important. So having a great pitch deck and a big data room and figuring out how to do business model, how to build a good business model, and how to figure out your market sizing, etc. Those are crucial, but it's more about proving that you can execute and proving that you've thought through the area. It's not that we're going to say, okay, now you stick to everything you've said, and we're going to see that everything pans out exactly as you said it. But it's more about being able to show that I understand this problem, I understand this market, I know who the competition is, I've done my research. And if you can't do that, then you're kind of showing inability to execute, essentially. So those things are important, but not for the same reasons that people might think.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's more about assessing their capability in learning something new, because I believe no one's doing a pitch deck in school. Like you just learn how to do a pitch deck when you need to do a pitch deck, right? And same for like a business plan and all the rest of the things that you need to do, like a data room and whatever. Going back to the topic of impact measurement, because I really try to focus on that aspect of this conversation. I think I had one question that was important for me to understand is, how much of like a limiter versus a controller should it be in an investment decision? And by that, I mean, like, should that be something that you look at and say, okay, that's a yes or no, versus something that drives your decision in a place, but doesn't necessarily affected too much, right? Like, where do you put that weight on the balance?
I I don't believe putting that much weight on what that impact will be. As long as, I mean, of course, like I said, the initial assessment of it being a positive impact and it being enough what your fund considers positive impact, like, reaching that threshold and ideally pretty low threshold, I think is good enough. But then after that, I think the more time you spend on that, the more you're limiting the returns for your fund. You're limiting other aspects of trying to figure out if this is successful. If you have a founding team is stronger, but they have slightly more limited impact, and then this one is a weaker team but slightly higher impact, are you going to choose the weaker team over it? And if you have to do that because your framework says that you need to always choose the one with higher impact, then I think you're shooting yourself in the foot by probably building a worse fund. And we are actually seeing quite a lot of climate tech funds who have a lot of restrictions from their LPs. I mean, even EIF is known to put restrictions on having impact tied to carry and having specific frameworks that people have to follow, meaning that we sometimes have investors who want to invest in our companies to say, oh, I can't do that because, this is more nature based and we have a CO2 target. And we're like, okay, but this is clearly climate and this is clearly massive impact. And they're like, yeah, but it just doesn't fit into the framework that we've done or our LPs have given us. And I just feel like, oh my God, like that's terrible. Like, and that's sadly, I think what happens when you start setting up too many frameworks, or specifically where LPs are asking you to do so without being there in the space themselves. Because I mean, I think we need to return good funds as well. If we build climate funds that have worse returns than other funds, LPs aren't going to put more money into climate. I don't want them to just say, let's put 5 or 10% of our money into climate because we want to do the good thing. This is not philanthropy. I want them to say, oh, we're putting money into climate because this is where we're going to have the highest returns. But in order for that to happen, I think us as climate VCs, we need to actually give them those returns. And that means that we have to focus on returns that will have a positive impact. But would it be the best impact that you would possibly have? I don't know. Probably not. There are probably other things that could have had a higher impact, but then would it have been $1 billion company? Would it have had the same revenue, or would it have been a compromise? I don't know. So I think it's like trying to find that balance is really difficult. And for us, we're very much on the side of we're going to return a good fund to our LPs. We're going to show people that you can put money into climate and make money. And then some people might say, oh, but is this climate enough when they look at our portfolio? And I'm okay with that. But because we're going to say, well, it's all positive impact, then whether it, hits your level of enough, it doesn't really matter to me.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and there's a lot to say about your what you just said right now. I'm curious about first. Let's talk about the framework, because I'm curious if you guys have a framework at Pale Blue Dot. Because for me, the way I understand it so far is that basically you have this: this is bad, this is neutral, this is positive. You only invest in the positive. And then the second part of your framework is just to say, okay, what is a climate thesis around that product or company? And if those two are there, that's enough. Is that the case?
Yeah, pretty much. I think when we look at the investment, it's very much like the kind of climate thesis for us to say to each other that this is why this is big. Like if they have never seen this area, we'll say this is better because the XYZ, like I've done the research, and then that's pretty much it. And then we just focus on the business case after that. And then, like I said, we have things like, ESG due diligence where we remove risks. And then we have more of the self-assessment where we really try to get them to identify impact. And we have climate pledges and stuff, but it's a lot. It's mainly qualitative, and it comes in a later stage. Saying that we are an SFDR 9 company, so we are Article 9, and there's certain things we have to do just because of compliance, and we do that, but we do a minimum amount of work like once a year, and using existing tools that make it as easy as possible. But none of that goes into the investment decision. This comes in after they're in the portfolio. We do the reporting that we have to for compliance reasons. I can go into why I dislike SFDR if you want to, but it doesn't come into the decision for us.
Yeah, I think the main point about SFDR for me, or the main thing I see, at least from the outside perspective, is that there's a reporting that you need to do from an impact perspective at the end
Yeah.
of the year, which, as you said, you're probably doing it very light touch. But going back to the LP conversation, is it important for you that your LP really wants to invest in climate, or would you be fine with having someone that doesn't necessarily care about climate, but actually just wants to make money?
I'm actually okay with both because I like the idea that someone who would have put their money into, something that could have been negative impact actually put their money into us and see good returns and say, okay, I should put more money into this as well. And I do think that, we have to have a bit of a pragmatic approach if we want people to put more money into climate, where we actually are kind of open to more people. Saying that, we do value alignment assessments with the funds that we take on. Also, because we think it's also super important to have these conversations, and we have been in a situation where we've been fortunate enough to have enough interest that we've been able to say that, look, we're going to choose who gets to invest in fund two based on our requirements. And then I've interviewed all of these LPs on, where the money comes from, but also like how are you spending it? If we return a 3x fund and we return money, where is it going to go? Like if it's a pension fund and it's going to give you more money into the retirement fund, amazing. But if they're saying, oh, but then we're definitely going to put it in oil, then it's like, well, that's not great. That's not necessarily something we'll be super proud to back, right? Or to know. So we do some assessments, but I think we need more people to put more money into climate and to understand this is an actual good opportunity to make money and not just see it as philanthropy.
Yeah, but I think it's fair to say that you need alignment as well, because as you said, like you will not be driven to return a great fund if you know that most of your LPs will invest in oil after the fact. If like if
Yeah,
that's the only thing, then you're just doing bad as opposed to trying to do good. And do you
yeah.
think LPs should drive you more? So like, do you think there should be more really climate focused LPs that pushes you into like very specific thesis or very specific area of climate? Like, do you think that's the role of LPs, or do you think GPs are much more equipped to invest in the companies that they think have the most impact and will be successful? Because as you said just before, I think something I wanted to touch on is like in assessing two companies that have different level of impact, but one with a great team and one with a slightly weaker team, you must see the 10-year vision where like if one becomes a unicorn or like a big company and has massive impact because of the scale it is, and the other one dies after 1 year, then the balance, is much in favor for the companies that succeeded. But going back to that topic, do you think GPs are much more equipped to find the companies that have the most impact in the long term?
I think LPs have a lot of they they have they're essentially what they say has a lot of weight. So they can easily say that we want you to measure the impact of your companies, or we want you to know that you're doing positive investments. Like we want to know what sectors you do investment. We want you to be able to justify why each investment is good. Like I think that there should be some light instructions from the LPs in terms of that the fact that they do want to see positive impact on the world as well as good returns, and that is an expectation that they have. But now, what I don't like, and as mentioned, some funds are putting restrictions on how they should be measuring impact, and that I think is going too far when you're saying, oh, this is exactly what we think is the best way of measuring impact, and this is how we think you should build a climate fund, then I think it becomes very restrictive. And we're lucky enough to be in a position where we could say no to all of the LPs who came with specific ideas of how a climate fund should measure impacts, or what a climate fund should do, or what sectors climate funds should put money into. And we just said no thanks. Like we're very thoughtful on these topics ourselves. Like we want to figure that out ourselves, and we're going to tell you this is what we're going to do, and if you want to back it, you can. But and then of course we could discuss what else goes into the LPA and what's important to you, but we're not going to tell you how we should do our job and how we should pick, because we think we're going to do a worse job if we take all the input from our LPs. So I don't believe that they should go that far. But saying kind of lightly, like, we expect some positive impact and we expect you to tell us what it is every year. We expect you to give us a report of how the portfolio is doing and what they're doing for the world. Like, that's not unreasonable. And yeah, if anything, it's much encouraged from my side, because I think we could identify the bad players as well and not just reward the good ones.
No, for sure. And how much in depth your annual reporting goes into? Like, what's a flavor of your annual reporting to your LP regarding impacts?
So we do a kind of quarterly reporting where we have a climate thesis, and then we have some KPIs. And essentially, every one of our company has a climate KPI that they set up themselves. So again, we don't say to them what you should be measuring. We tell them that you need to figure out what your climate KPI is and what's easy for you to measure and what is tied to your revenue goals. And then they measure that, and then we kind of put that in the graph in the quarterly report. So our LPs find out the KPI, and then they know the thesis. But and then of course they do the SFDR reporting, the kind of from a compliance side. But that's the only thing that we tell our investors. So it's not very in depth.
What are some KPIs that you see from the startups? Like, just to give an example, I'm pretty sure there's CO2 reduction or CO2 removal somewhere in there. But like, what are the other type of KPIs you see?
I mean, sometimes it's literally it's a business KPI, but it's tied to something positive. So I don't know. For example, if we have a green investment company where all the money that goes into it goes into green investment projects, then you could just report on the AUM of the money you have in the fund, because we know that all of that money AUM is being used to fund the green investments. So a lot of times it is actually the business KPIs that are being reported. Sometimes it is more about how much data coverage there is of a specific place, and stuff like this as well. And then we explain how that's kind of linked to positive impact. But it really depends. But it's not just CO2 reduction at all. And as mentioned, we also do nature and other things that aren't even measurable in CO2. And to add to that as well, that does mean that we cannot aggregate the data, and that we're very aware of. We can't easily say, here's an aggregation of the impact of our portfolio. But I also think if you can do that, then you must have simplified it a lot, and you must have restricted yourself a lot.
Yeah, or you've invested in one specific area of climate, which makes it very much easier. And within that reporting, I'm pretty sure, like, how much do you then aggregate the financial performance as well? Because, like, curious about, like, how does that plays out? Like, the difference between like the impact reporting and the financial reporting, like, how does that come together within your fund?
Yeah, neither one is aggregated. And that's also because, we're not just wide on how we see climate, we're also very wide on what we invest in. So we have software, we have hardware, we have B2B, we have B2C, we have, SaaS marketplaces, we every type of business model out there. So it's very hard to say revenue versus revenue. Like, okay, this is ARR, this is also ARR, but it's not subscription ARR. Like, we're constantly having the conversation of, how do you put these two next to each other and trying to figure out like who's actually doing better on this front, because they're completely different business model with completely different growth trajectories. And some are taking a much bigger chunk of their market, others have a tiny chunk of the market, but like a lot of space to grow. So it's, to answer your question, we don't aggregate that either. I mean, if you look at the returns from an LP side, then of course we look at the multiple capital, like we look at what valuations they've raised on, and we're really looking at the current market value of the fund. But in terms of revenue or in terms of impact, it's not aggregated and it's not easily quantified.
And do you think that gives you less visibility in your portfolio?
No, not really. I mean, we have all the numbers. I just think it's hard to go out and say that this is this is how we're aggregating our success within the portfolio. I just think it's hard to say that to LPs, but otherwise, I don't think it matters. I mean, we have the visibility from how each of our companies are doing. We're just not putting them side by side because they're so different businesses.
Yeah, for sure. one last topic on that, and then we'll get into like a round of fire question where you'll have to be really fast to answer some of these questions. But first, you mentioned the carried interest link to the impact, which I think is probably a topic where I have a very strong opinion. But like, what do you think about this carried interest link to impact? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? How do you think about it?
I think, again, the hard thing is that this is not something that happens to other funds. And it almost feels like a bit of a punishment for, climate or impact funds, where your impact has to be tied to carry. And that means you have to have a framework, which is relatively restrictive because, again, you have to aggregate everyone's performance in order to fit into that framework. So you're already like, you're narrowing who you can invest in, and then you're narrowing returns of the fund. And then you're like, and if you don't do that, your carry isn't kind of tied to that. So it just feels like you're not incentivized to make the best investments and have the highest returns. You're incentivized to make everyone fit into this mold, even if it doesn't give you the best returns of the fund. And that feels kind of unfair, specifically as if you're fundraising as any other fund. It's not that even negative impact would take away your carry. Like, you could make the worst investments. Like, you could invest in only like weapons and porn and games and have the highest returns, and no one would ever say that your carry is restricted. So I just feel like, to me, it's insane that we're thinking about it in the way of, oh, let's put more frameworks and more restrictions of everyone who's trying to do impact. Like, greenwashing was like the biggest problem that ever existed, like compared to all of the really visibly negative things that are being that where money's being where there's people putting money into. So just for me, I just feel like why go that way? It just feels really silly, to be honest.
That's interesting. I have a different opinion on. I think the logic and the thought process that got into impact carried interest is probably good. Like it's probably comes from like a good ambition that is to say like it will push GPs to do the best they can to have an impact. On the other side, I agree with you that it's a bit restrictive. And how do you define impact, for example, for nature-based solutions that are not touching any CO2 emissions, for example? Like I think some areas of climate are a bit harder to really measure, and therefore it's a bit of a weird situation for if you have your carried interest linked to your impacts. Um, but we are getting towards this at the end of this episode. Let's do a quick round of fire question. I'll ask you to answer in 1 or 2 sentences maximum. Are you ready?
All right. Yes, let's go.
What's the best innovation you've seen within the climate ecosystem?
Fast. Okay. I love everything within climate risk. I mean, I maybe the innovation level isn't like super high, but the fact that we can take all of this existing data and actually use it to understand how this is affecting, us, our houses, our factories, etc. For me, that's just such a crazy, obvious thing, and I love everything that has to do with kind of climate risk and resilience.
Great. What is the one thing that you look for 2025? Like one technology, one innovation, a startup, something that happens in 2025 that you're looking for?
I want to see more stuff on kind of supply chain resilience. I'm excited about that. Um, but also more understanding, kind of the risks within our grid, for example. Like, I think those type of things are, again, I'm saying the same thing essentially, risk and resilience. If I wanna broaden it, is very exciting.
Yeah, the grid topic is very interesting, specifically within Europe, where I feel like we could do better at, coordinating or like making it one market. I feel like America looks at Europe as one market, but we internally look at it from like very different angles and perspective, which I don't think is a good thing. Do you think all VCs will become impact VCs in 10 or 20 years from now?
Uh, I think that, again, it depends on how we define impact. Like, if for me, impact can also be negative impact. Like, everyone has an impact. So I feel like we are all impact VCs on that front. Uh, can we actually say that we're going to measure everyone's impact to some extent? I think so. Are we good? And therefore, hopefully, we're going to be pushing people to have a bit more positive impact to some extent. Yes, not a clear answer, but I think to some extent we're getting there.
That for sure, interesting. What is one very much green flag when you look at investing in a startup? Like, what's one thing you look at and you're like, okay, I want to invest right now?
Um, the founder. When a founder is super ambitious, super value driven, they are set to solve this problem. They see it as their purpose in life to be solving this problem, and they have a kind of clarity of thought and can explain exactly how they're going to get there. That's when I kind of fall in love with the company.
Love that. And what is one red flag on the opposite? And you cannot say when the founder is not good.
um, I would say too much focus on the impact. Too much focus on like, oh, this could be the craziest thing ever, and like too little focus on the business essentially. So, we're like, okay, we like, as a climate VC as well, we do know that this is going to be good for climate if this happens, but there's not enough steps on actually understanding the business case and what it would look like and why this even can scale to $1 billion valuation. So too much focus on impact and too little focus on the business.
So you want climate tech companies to make money, which is a great thing.
Yeah.
What is one advice for a climate tech founder today? Like if you meet someone graduating from university, wants to start a company, what's one advice?
Learn how to build startups in general. I think climate tech is no different to any other startup tech business. Like figure out, go to YC startup school, try to figure out like what everyone else knows, try to figure out what everyone has already learned in terms of growth marketing and product-led sales, etc. Like there's a lot of these stuff that's already out there. Like don't try to reinvent the wheel fully because you're climate and you're completely different than everyone else. Try to figure out how do everyone else doesn't do this, and then figure out what applies to you. Don't think that, oh, I'm in a different bubble and I shouldn't be interacting with the rest of the startup world. Like they all have the knowledge that we need to take if we're going to grow businesses in climate.
So that's very interesting. And I love the fact that you come back to climate tech is no different to any other type of startups. What's one advice for an aspiring impact VC?
Don't put too many restrictions on yourself. We need climate VCs to return money, which means that we need to focus on building really good VCs. That also does mean that not every company in climate is VC fundable, and not every company in climate is VC compatible. So don't be super restrictive and try and start by thinking of like what's going to have all the biggest impact in the world, because then you might not build a good VC fund and we might not get more money into climate VC. So really think about like, where is climate and VC aligned? Which kind of categories can, we grow impact and VC side by side, and then invest in those.
I love that. What's one book, podcast, movie, TV show that you would recommend to anyone that would aspire to be in your seat someday?
One book recently that I really liked was Jason Hickel's Less is More, on the growth and really just thinking about what the future world is going to look like, and like what kind of subsidies we need to have in place and what kind of business models we should put more weight on, etc., for the future. So a lot of my thinking is like, what is the future going to look like, and therefore who should we invest in now? And I think this is a book that gave me some thoughts on that for sure.
Love that. I think the idea of also doing more with less, which is a bit of the opposite of what you just said, but it's very interesting. One last question. Who is the next climate GP or VC that I should interview?
That's a good question. The one that comes to mind is Laura Fox from Street Life Ventures. They're our new and New York-based fund, essentially raising a fund on kind of around sustainable cities, and it's all of course climate as well. But I think they're doing something super exciting, and I like Laura and Sanam, who are building it, are very, very inspiring.
Great, love that. I will definitely reach out. Well, just to summarize quickly what we've learned today. So impact measurement shouldn't be restrictive. It should be used as a tool for good and to drive good decisions, but not to restrict it to specific business. I think that was your main point of view on this topic, which I really enjoyed. I love the fact that you think about the carried impact a bit as a too much of a restriction to that aspect as well. I love the fact that you compare climate tech startups to very much standard startups or like technological startups, which I think is the best thing to be able to learn from those that are already growing fast and be able to learn and apply the same framework and principles. That's kind of my summary of today. If people want to reach out to you, where can they find you online?
I'm very easy to find. My email is on my LinkedIn. It's on our website, heidi@paleblue.vc. I think just emailing me is the best. LinkedIn messages, I'm not quite on top of, but email always works.
Love that. Well, if you like this episode and if you like the show, you can always subscribe, comment, and give it 5 stars if you're on a podcast platform. That gives us some support. Thank you so much, Heidi.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.